Hello Propernomics people, and welcome to the Sunday supplement from the 26th of May 2024. And this week I titled the piece Election Section 21. That was of course a reference to the Renters Reform Bill that has very recently died in Parliament. I'm sure it'll be resuscitated in new form by the probable new Labour government. Let's see, whoever comes back in, I'm sure it's going to be revived, because ultimately it was in the Conservative Manifesto 2019 to abolish Section 21. And they haven't managed to achieve that. Of course, COVID got in the way a little bit, but still, it's been too slow. It's been too much rebellion and all the rest of it. But as you'll know, I like to start off these Sunday supplements with a quote. And this week's quote was, "I prided myself on being unflappable, even in the most chaotic of circumstances." And that was from Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, who people will remember from Gulf War, US Army General. Now, before we get started in earnest, I'm delighted to say our next property business workshop is still taking bookings, even though it's on the day of the election, Thursday the 4th of July, and there are still some tickets left with an early bird discount attached to them. So Rod and I are this time taking on the fundamentals of property investment, risk mitigation and controls, relevant investment metrics, differing secured debt arrangements and loan structures, and scaling your property portfolio or business or businesses. Why, when and how. So it's a central London location. As I said, Thursday the 4th of July. It's the most important thing going on Thursday 4th of July. Just remember that. Thanks to the early bookers who've made it possible and viable for us to book a room for the event. And there's still a 10% off reward for any more early bookers that there are. So the link is bit.ly/PBWTHREE. Now, I've this week referred back to a conclusion from last week, which of course last week things have changed quite a lot in the past week because of the election announcement. And I said, I quote, "Rental demand is going to continue to skyrocket and expect rent increases at or above wage increases for some years to come. The future on that side looks incredibly dim for tenants and strengthens the investment case quite a lot. Remember, this isn't the only fruit. What will compliance look like? What will changes in tenants' rights look like? There will still be plenty to put people off. Labour aren't going to be kinder than the Tories to landlords. That would be so forward-thinking as to be impossible. The housing market is going to get more and more broken." End quote. How timely. I would have laid decent odds an election being called for just about Q3 at the end of last week's piece. You can see the only logic there is. Growth figures look the best they have for a long time. Inflation, optically anyway, under control. We should all know that print is going back up from 2.3, but I'll touch on that anyway. But election it is. An act of spite before Rishi was pushed. I'm not sure I buy that conspiracy theory. It likely is their best chance, but the betting markets are putting them at a 2 to 3% chance for a majority. Maybe that will improve before the 4th of July. Rather than say 1 to 2%. I mean, what's the difference at the margin? It's very marginal, that's for sure. I popped a poll on my LinkedIn where one of the options, with me only half joking, was that Sunak fancies a summer holiday this year. So I'm going to use a bit of a different format in the supplement this week. I've stripped the macro right back because I want and need to leave as much room as possible for an independent review of the independent review from the Private Rented Sector Commission. Not commissioned by the PRS itself, of course, which is too fractured to do such a thing. Simply because I have not been as concerned by the contents of a meaningful political report which skillfully gives the air of having consulted all the relevant parties ever. I was more concerned when Corbyn and McDonnell were too close to numbers 10 and 11 for comfort, although they were never given a realistic chance of getting in. Watch Stephen Cowan, the author of this report that I'm going to discuss today, very closely in his political career, is all I will say. There's some holes to be poked in the report, and I'm going to drive a coach and horses through it with room left for an armoured tank division to get in behind me. Then I'm going to attempt to distill things right back down into some meaningful conclusions. They have 5, so it would seem appropriate that we do too, or reword their 5 to be truly independent and also meaningful. Might be a better shout, but let's see. Anyway, let's get into the macro bulletin. It was a slow starter this week, but we still have 4 key areas of focus. Inflation numbers. PMI flash numbers, you know that I love those. Consumer confidence, and of course, the 5-year gilts and swaps. Inflation first, 2.3 was the headline. I threw my dart at 2.4 because I thought the economy was just too hot. Retail sales did very badly in April, well below consensus, but Easter being in March was mostly blamed, although that was already baked into the consensus figures, of course. Perhaps consumption figures are down indeed, at least a little bit further. And that will likely continue to be the case because people hate uncertainty and elections bring uncertainty. The rest of the economic world, having confidently started the year predicting it would hit 2% or below in April, to which I scoffed at the time, we're at 2.1 as a consensus. That includes the Bank of England. So this 2.3 was a miss to the upside again, but that only counts for people really looking closely, like me, and by extension you, for watching this. I had messages expecting me to be confidently predicting a June interest rate cut, but as at Wednesday 9 a.m, I was at 90% no cut, 10% yes. The markets were more like 20% for a cut at the time, I later found out when I looked. That was before the election announcement, which shouldn't make any difference. We'll see, won't we? But also before some more data was released, which would lead more towards a cut. Still nowhere near odds on for a cut in 4 weeks' time, though, and that was the PMI flashes and the retail figures released this week, which were a little bit cooler than expected. So here's the bullets anyway. CPI 2.3 down from 3.2 in March, but based primarily on the large cut in the energy price cap for households from the 1st of April. That was 12.3%. There's another one now baked in, as Ofgem has spoken and set the cap from 1st of July to another 7.2% lower. Still 22.7% higher than January 22, but 22.7 is about inflation in this entire cycle. So it looks like the percentages have, on average, always dangerous, righted themselves. Expectation was 2.1, so a miss to the upside, 20 basis point miss to the upside, apart from anything else. July now baked in to lower the print in July, but the base effect of super high energy prices had already abated somewhat compared to April 23, so the effect won't be as dramatic. It's still disinflationary, although July's print is likely the last one where the energy price cap is going to be disinflationary. Core inflation 3.9 versus a 3.6 expectation. Too high. Month-on-month core 0.9, highest since April 23. Not to be a surprise at all for those who followed the drum I've banged about the minimum wage increases. No surprise that prices would have to rise somewhat in order to cope with that cost pressure on businesses. CPI month-on-month 0.3% up in spite of the energy price cuts. RPI month-on-month 0.5% up. April is the month each year where lots of wages do go up, including national minimum, so we do expect those hotter prints. History shows us that. RPI down to 3.3, which looks positively manageable compared to where RPI has been. More detail on inflation next month, though. There's bigger fish to fry today. PMI flashes. PMIs were hot for April, which is why I was so confident we would overshoot the consensus. It seems they're just not baked in enough. Anyway, these are the flash estimates for May in the now to be revised at the end of this month. I would think the revision will be downwards because of the trend and also because of the election announcement being just after the data collection period. But here's the tale of the tape. Composite PMI 52.8 down from 54.1 for April. Manufacturing surprisingly strong, 51.3, good news. And services surprisingly weak but still printing 52.9. Consensus forecast was 54.7, so quite a big miss to the downside there. This, and I always say be careful before interpreting 1 month figures, looks like another reason why the timing of the election was smart. That's a fair drop from the 55.0 peak printed in April. It's still a good number but a bad direction of travel, and we'd always prefer 53 or above for an economy charging forward. It doesn't point to an overheating services segment of the economy, and remember it is a massive segment of the economy, but functioning well. Let's hope we don't drop that much again for June, though. I'd imagine in terms of a variety of services, they may well pick up very strongly before the election. Tax planning, for example. Anyway, on to consumer confidence. The overall score was good at -17. Bit sad that -17 is considered good these days, but 1 year ago it was -27. Every individual metric improved apart from major purchases. Remember, this is measuring intent, not action, but that moved down by -1. There was a very bullish print for personal financial situations over the next 12 months. +7 was the number. Things have improved on all metrics on the GfK survey over the past 12 months, aside from those major purchase intents. I think people are preferring saving at this time, perhaps incentivised by those higher rates. I understand that listeners to this and watchers won't necessarily be excited by 4 or 5% before tax, but some clearly are, and it's all relative, of course. It beats the times when they were getting 1% or less in the bank. Anyway, gilts and swaps will end this wash-up. The 5-year gilt had a miserable week from all of our perspectives, as the inflation missed to the upside and the core print as well meant 15 points went on the gilt yield almost immediately at the open on Wednesday. The timeline is inflation figures 7 a.m, gilt market opens 8 a.m. for those who don't know. We then tested 4.2, boo, and closed at 4.182 for the week, having opened at 4.02. I actually thought after the retail figures a bit might come off this, and there is evidence of disinflation if you look hard enough, but the inflation print looking back really was quite a miss, and a lot of eggs had been put into that basket. Thursday's close on the gilt was 4.17 and the swap 4.088, so the discount level is preserved, but we're above the 4% number on the swap again. Yuck. We might be stuck there for a while, although I think we will start to decay. I will look forward to seeing the finalised May PMIs because this hot streak looks to be coming to an end in growth before it's even got underway. It's quite symptomatic of the post-COVID moves in other developed economies, but a bit of a quicker cycle maybe. Let's see. Anyway, it looks like Chris Watkin had the week off from the stats at the moment on the real-time property market. I couldn't find them on his LinkedIn or Property Industry Eye, so I'll leave those for the week and come back to them next week and skip straight to what is an extensive main course. So, the independent review of the UK's private rented housing sector. Here we go. Put it into context first up. Look, it's just a report. It comes from a good place, wanting to sort out good quality housing for people. Everybody wants that. The arguments are really twofold. Who pays for it? And cui bono, aka who benefits? And also, how does it actually happen, rather than discussing nice to haves? So we kick off the foreword with some powerful chat. The housing sector is broken. Agreed. For many people, 1% of the population could be many, and this is the one example straight away of the deliberately misleading and emotive language used throughout the piece, which does nothing to hide the ideological bent behind it. The opportunity to live in a secure, affordable, accessible and good home is out of reach, we are told. That's set to remain for generations to come. I'm inclined to agree, but the system needs significant change. Again, I'd agree. Does it need Labour's changes though? Strange, I thought this was an independent report, but on point 2 we're already talking about Labour, and this report throughout very much assumes they are winning the election, something the main party have been keen to not appear to presume, of course, for fear of being seen as presumptuous or arrogant. Between 2010 and 2020, the UK experienced the lowest amounts of new homes built since the end of World War II. This is blamed in the report on dramatic cuts in funds available for building affordable housing. This is a complex problem and is no doubt a major contributory factor, but it isn't the whole explanation by any means. The UK is then accused of having among the lowest rates of home ownership in Europe. I thought time to do some fact checking here because things are a little emotive. Countries with lower home ownership rates and therefore larger rental sectors: Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Denmark, France and Sweden. Comparables, competitors and countries often painted as Narnia. I'm not convinced that the home ownership rates in Eastern Europe, Malta or Luxembourg are particularly aspirational for the UK or relevant. In both Switzerland and Germany, which are looked at as two of the more desirable destinations in mainland Europe, home ownership is under 50%. So on its own, is this a problem? The UK compares to that with 65% home ownership. I'm not sure that it is. And if this sets the scene for bastardising statistics to suit the argument, then prepare the hounds, Frederick. England has 1.4 million fewer households living in social housing than in 1980. There's no effort to see any of this as a positive. Surely society's success might be gauged by fewer people needing to live in social housing? Right to buy has been a huge problem, but at no point does the report attempt to address the fact that many tenants prefer the PRS to the social sector thanks to the poor standards in the social sector and poor locations of much of the social housing that's left. Because the market has been involved, the better stuff has been bought and the less desirable remains. This isn't universally true, of course, but it's also an inevitable consequence of the fact that people aren't stupid. So, the report then mentions plans to restore house building targets. Dropping them has always been a mess and a joke, to be honest. But will they be hit? Reforming planning, always a Labour policy that few developers will ever be against, of course. It upsets the Conservative heartlands who want no building in their backyards, naturally. And sorting out the compulsory purchase compensation code too. Now that sounds innocuous, but the FT article, for the headline for the article they quote in the report says Labour plans to tackle housing crisis by forcing landowners to sell at lower prices. Now, That's not typical of the FT. If that was the Telegraph, we might be able to put a line through that. But the FT doesn't tend to get particularly political, so they must feel pretty strongly about it. That does sound less ideal, doesn't it? But they were happy to quote that in the report. Seems they don't mind a bit of intervention, the authors of this one. Anyway, apparently, although there's no reference to this, government policy has long viewed the PRS as the best placed to meet short-term housing needs rapidly, but never envisaged it as a long-term solution for a large proportion. Remember, we're still talking under 20%, so it is a lot of people, but it isn't a large proportion, in my opinion, for the population. This needs challenging and, again, fits an ideological agenda. It also runs against a lot of their argument. Why try so hard for decent homes, etc., if they're not fit for purpose? Sounds like the long-run ideological objective is just to destroy the PRS. Funding and policy support is essential. Reducing the dependency on the PRS, certainly worth a go. PRS simply plugged the gap left by abject failures of successive governments on housing policies. There seems to be no mention of those who were in charge in the middle of the biggest boom of all time in the PRS. Remind me, that started in 1996 with the buy-to-let mortgage and came to an end in about 2007, or certainly went on a big pause for a few years anyway. Who was in charge then again? Then the stats start, and we see some incongruence throughout the report. It would be unfair to lay the blame at this totally at the report's door, although one single source of truth would be helpful, because the data collection on rental has been so poor. They do grab this from the ONS. There were just under 5 million privately rented dwellings in England in 2021, according to estimates published in the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities dwelling stock, including vacants collection, and our Census 2021 10-year data set. Most say 4.6 million or so in the other data sets, and the problem with the census, of course, is it only happens every 10 years. In October 2022, apparently 2.74 million landlords declared income from letting a property. Many of those may well have been couples or partnerships, of course, so that doesn't tell us how many properties per landlord, but it does give us some idea as to the number of landlords that we have. It's okay though, because next comes one of the laziest and most unacceptable conclusions I've ever seen in a report ever. I'm reproducing this in its entirety. PRS is the most expensive of all forms of housing tenure and rents are increasing. In 2023, the Centre for Policy Studies noted, since 2010, the cost of renting has gone up by 44.5% according to the Halifax. During this period, wages have risen by 30.4% and inflation has risen by 24%. This is hardly a sign of a functioning market. There is significant regional variation in PRS rents. Bull dust, frankly. Renting is more expensive than buying, sometimes. It has flip-flopped in recent times, and the comparisons are completely unfair. Often this is performed as rent versus mortgage interest, or rent versus mortgage payment, but both of those are wrong. Costs of running a property can easily run to 20% of rents, simply in compliance, licensing and maintenance. When there's a new roof, that might often be 50% or more of rent in that year on its own. Similar figures for windows. This is just frankly a lie that needs to be exposed. Here's how I would properly compare the cost of home ownership to the cost of renting. Take the average deposit and make an allowance for the fact that it isn't invested in a medium risk ISA or tax paying account if you prefer. Remember insurance, compliance, maintenance and make an allowance for it. Remember frictional costs, stamp duty, land tax, legal costs, surveys, include those in your amount for the first point. Compare council tax bands and bills on average, the running costs of an average rental versus an average owner-occupier property. Regardless of which side of the argument that favours, it's also the cost of actually attempting to be balanced and find the truth. And then amortise all costs over the average length of home ownership, 22.6 years at the last count, rather than just fixing a leaky tap or whatever. When that piece of work has been done, let's have a proper discussion. I'll do it, although I'd expect to be paid for that, so I won't hold my breath. This report thinks it's okay to quote a paper from 2023 that uses figures from 2021 and frankly gets them completely wrong. It quotes inflation as 24.2% since 2010. It adds up the percentages rather than compounding them. This is inconceivable mathematics if this is supposed to be a serious report. It also handily understates inflation but overstates rent increases by looking at years where rents went downwards. It looks like a lack of ability and or carelessness, but at this point I'm suspicious. Some questions. Why not use the ONS's figures? Why use Halifax's rental figures? Not because it suits the argument a lot more, is it? Why only look until 2021? Not because 2022 and 2023's inflation figures would massively detract from the argument, is it? It isn't the cost of renting, it's rent payments they're examining, and I don't trust the source of the figures. This is guff, utter guff, and used for major conclusions. These numbers have to be correct before they're put in front of proper politicians. Rant paused. Breathing exercises completed. Onwards. They mention constant threats of eviction. Everyone knows Section 21 is used as an easy, or easier, more like, route to remove tenants from properties where they're not paying. Of course, there's been a large need to get properties vacant for sale since the interest rates have gone up. This nuance has been completely lost in the report. This is a tragedy. The tragedy of not even understanding the problem. They also say the PRS is also where Britain's poorest people live, and they do so in ever-increasing numbers. How terribly emotive. In 2019, the National Housing Federation estimated 1.3 million children were living in poverty in private rented homes in England, which was a 69% increase since 2008. It identified how high housing costs both cause and worsen poverty. Some 100,000 homeless households currently live in insecure temporary accommodation, much of it sourced from the private rented sector. They don't offer any evidence of it being where Britain's poorest people live, and indeed the ONS and the Bank of England recent reports would very much disagree. I'll go a step further. The English Housing Survey, published last year, used as the Bible of rental sectors in general when it suits, but it is a comprehensive piece of work, proves that this is an abject lie. The average and median incomes in social housing households are a lot lower than in the PRS. I've used that as this week's graph, because these outright lies need to be called out where they're used. Now, what it does in this week's graph is it splits the income into quintiles. You can go and check it out on my LinkedIn or on the Partners in Property website, and you can very, very clearly see the people in the bottom 20% income quintile are about 4 times as likely to be in social housing as they are in the PRS, as you would hope and think if social housing is being used adequately and correctly. So, utter claptrap, I'm afraid. So, there's more lies here as well. Temporary accommodation, quote marks, imported from shelter. Well, probably fair because temporary accommodation can easily last over a year. Around half of people or households in temporary accommodation run over that 1 year mark. That is a tragedy. A tragedy mostly being based on there being nowhere for them to go. The lies, though, much of the temporary accommodation sourced from the private sector, that whole quote hinges on a report from London and Greater Manchester, which cites as its most damning piece of evidence 1/5 of all PRS stock being used for temporary accommodation in one single London borough in 2022, which was Enfield. So much of it being sourced from the PRS, from a left-leaning think tank who are given a D grade for transparency in their funding, putting them in an equivalent position to the Institute of Economic Affairs, who are roundly criticised for their lack of transparency in funding on the other side of the political compass. It's just nonsense. Then, now it's time to use some stats from government and official sources, apparently, because now it suits. We get some insight we haven't had before. 94% of PRS landlords are individual landlords. 94%. 83% have fewer than 5 properties. 59% see their ownership as a rental property as a long-term investment to contribute to their pension. You could reframe that. Doesn't make a lot of money every year, but one day they're hoping for a payday, just like a pension. Now, this is from the English Private Landlord Survey. Funny how they found that one, but not the English Housing Survey report. Strange indeed. 71% are not and have never been in a professional organisation. It's that sort of fuel that makes you realise why politicians have pushed for more regulation. That screams people don't take their obligations seriously, and we've all seen those who don't. It isn't 71% of us, though. It does support the conclusion that the PRS is made up of amateur landlords, though. Comments around the Renters Reform Bill are, for the moment, null and void, since it isn't going through in this Parliament. There's chat over the court process. I expect it'll be left to rot now, with a token extra piece of funding if the ideologues get their way, although of course this would backfire badly. One very bad eviction process will soon get more and more of these landlords out of the market. The worst bit here, stepping away, is the total lack of understanding or reference to any form of transition period away from amateur landlords to a professional sector. How long should that take? What will the outcomes for tenants be? How can we protect the tenants in transition? Are these not questions you'd expect that side of the argument to be asking? Why do they not even go there? The last sentence of the foreword, and yes, we're still on the foreword, so buckle up and get the kettle on again, is the most arrogant of all. Fixing the dysfunctional housing sector and its causes is a clear priority for Labour's government in waiting. This report proposes some practical means of applying a framework that would raise standards and improve security for renters across the private rented sector. It absolutely does not concentrate on practical means. It's not without merit throughout, and some of what's proposed is workable and should be welcomed by a forward-thinking PRS, but is absolutely not practical means. It's largely driven by ideological claptrap that will lead to worse outcomes for tenants and renters. Anyway, I'm going to press on through the executive summary of recommendations. There is merit in looking in a much deeper dive too about rent controls versus rent pressure zones versus rent stabilisation. I'm going to get into that at a shallow level today here, but 1 week I'll give that the full deep dive treatment because we need to get into the economic merits and demerits. There's much more cause for hope here than anything, but there are a few clips around the ear and a few more that are needed before we get to the sensible discussion stage. So buckle up. There's 46 distinct sections here, some follow on from others, and 5 points upon which these recommendations rest. This only takes us to page 15 of this 118-page report. So I'm keen to put into context just how deep this report is, even though, as already discussed, it is woefully shallow and cherry-picks accordingly when it wants to. Here we go. First of all, the typical disclaimer, these views only belong to the Private Rented Sector Commission. Logo, the Labour Party red rose, supported by the Labour Housing Group. But anyway, let's gloss over that, the consummate professionals that we are. They then choose to make a distinction between two sorts of renters. Those on low incomes who rely on housing support to pay their rent, more accurately a portion of it in the vast majority of cases in this day and age, and those who pay for their own. I'm not sure this is that helpful, but that's the distinction they've chosen. The overall weakness in the data is not their fault and will take years to improve, and it will be a continuous improvement project anyway. They now claim that PRS is now the default tenure for lower income households. This isn't referenced or evidence. In fact, I think it's a lie. Only those who do not perform reference checks, including affordability checks, will let people to those who can't afford it. I think that type of landlord is shrinking in number and will soon be killed off, let alone die out, by these ideologues who want corporate landlords just as their blue counterparts did in 2015 and still do today. It could be accepted on the basis there is not enough social housing. The waiting lists have not made huge leaps forward historically, but again the data is too far out of date to be accurate or particularly relevant as at today. The next sentence is critical and does need to be accepted. This report does not seek to offer a comprehensive suite of economic solutions. Let's dwell on that for a minute. What use is the report then? Might be one pushback. Or the problem is too hard to solve, that's why it's been dodged. Any proposals not backed up with economic viability aren't going to happen at this time after the warning shots fired by the gilt markets in September and October 22 during the rain, or more like the drizzle, of Truss and Kwarteng. However, they do then take it on board within the report to set out a framework to improve renters' rights and standards and raise the standards across the sector. Sidestepping economics is very convenient, but lets them off the hook they should never be let off. I'd like to take this opportunity to completely reframe the debate. There is an economic cost to every further measure that is put into the private rental sector. It can only be funded in one of three ways. From the public purse, so everyone who pays tax, which is everybody, from the landlord, or from the tenant. In the real world, when the price of providing a service goes up, so does the cost of that service if the market allows. There is an economic concept that covers this nicely. It is called the price elasticity of demand. It varies from inelastic, demand doesn't go down much when the price goes up, normally essential goods, to elastic, goods that are or services that are easily dropped or substituted that are very price sensitive. Guess which one housing or shelter is? Inelastic, of course. Like petrol or diesel, housing is needed to make economic engines run. So, if every cost from here on was framed as something that cost the tenants more than the landlords, would those in the ivory towers think twice before imposing them? You're spending the tenants' money and then moaning about how unaffordable it is. Just understand this economic concept. What is the price elasticity of demand of housing, by the way, in the UK? estimated to be about 0.4, negative 0.4, which means if demand goes up 10%, as it might have gone in recent years, thanks to the huge numbers of immigrants that have come in on a net basis, apart from anything else, then ultimately if price goes up 10%, demand will only go down by 4% or so. That's what it means. That's how much housing is needed. You might think it would be even less than that, and there are estimates of it being even more inelastic than that, but that's where we are. So anyway, rant break 2. Blood pressure check. Somehow still 120/80. Let's press on. Here comes the first of the 5 points. For each of these, I've cut and pasted just so you can hear them in all their glory, and I'm going to line by line them. So, first, we recognise the crisis in the private rented sector can only be solved by a holistic approach to fixing all parts of the housing market. Can't argue with that. Labour will inherit a broken housing market, so that will be challenging. Not really sure you'd just be walking away from 97 to 2010 and the financial crisis, though. Anyway, it will require significant reform to planning and land development policies to increase the supply of genuinely affordable homes to rent and to buy. And here's the problem with walking away from economics when it suits to do so. There's plenty of economics in this paper as time goes on. It will require a lot more funding, bridging skills gaps. How about all of that? That is why Labour's proposed reforms of the planning and compulsory purchase compensation codes are essential. Planning reform, standard Labour, no loyalty to the home counties, etc., who are stuffed with NIMBYs, although realistically everywhere is. Fine on reform, not so great on compulsory purchase compensation codes, perhaps lots of meddling, some bad outcomes for some, but no doubt I suppose they deserve it as long as you subscribe to the politics of envy. Measures must be taken that urgently increase the supply of social housing so low income and homeless households do not have to rely on the PRS. Social housing should return to being the second largest sector in the housing market, with home ownership being the first. I can't make my mind up about this goal. I don't think I like it. It will take so long to sort out the social sector that hopefully by then there can be more homeowners if that's the way forward, or there can be more great quality rental properties if that's the solution, provided by the private sector and private investment, which Labour are not allergic to by any means from the chat that's come out of Rachel Reeves' mouth. Anyway, second, a comprehensive annually updated National Landlords Register is the essential mechanism for managing and enforcing standards in the PRS. I think this would probably have a use. Will it provide value for tenants as it costs tenants money? Is it the essential mechanism for managing and enforcing standards? It will make the job easier, but the job's already easy. Check the EPCs of new listings in the council area. Wouldn't take a single full-time equivalent employee to do that in most councils. If no EPC is listed, enforce. If the grade is F or below, enforce. Piece of cake, already, and not being done. The register should legally require landlords to register themselves, provide details of their properties and rents, and demonstrate compliance with an annually updated PRS decent home standard. Not clear whether everyone gets to see what next door is paying in rent here. Commercial sensitivity issues and tenants' privacy issues, I'd have thought. Compliance docs uploaded, fine. Millions of pounds to set up, no doubt, but if you're sure the tenants are getting value. The register should also oblige landlords to submit independent evidence of property and management compliance, gas safe, electrical test, etc., and include a responsibility to undertake and submit a surveyor's report regularly. The broken record comes on again. A regular surveyor's report? £500 plus VAT or similar? Good value for the tenant, right? Third, tenants must have security. No fault evictions must go, including the back door. No fault evictions that have been introduced by the Conservatives' Renters Reform Bill. Obviously that's a bit moot because it's now been terminated in Parliament after wash-up has been completed and Parliament's prorogued, but there we are. But I don't see the problem with Section 21 going as long as it was handled in the same way they handled the withdrawal of Section 33 in Scotland. That's been 7 years ago now and it hasn't caused a big issue. But they don't want it in the same way as Scotland's Section 33 removal. So just you wait. Fourth, first generation rent controls, freezing or cutting rents, will have a detrimental effect on the PRS. Hang on, bit of common sense finally. Also backed up by numerous real world examples. Knock me down with a feather. But third generation rent stabilisation measures are essential and should be used to limit increases within tenancies to the lower of local wage growth and CPI. Pause for a moment. Is this an unmitigated disaster on its own? I think not. write this into the proposed model tenancy agreement they would have everyone using, and everyone knows where they stand at the start of a lease. The rent goes up annually on those terms. Nice and easy. That's not how it would be implemented, of course. The lower of is arguable. No other double lock works on the basis of the lower of, but the corporate lobbyists seem happy. Granger say that they are. So that's where we might well be. Not a disaster, though. Fifth, measures to stop PRS landlords moving to other sectors such as the short-term and holiday-let sector, or the more profitable, nightly paid temporary accommodation and supported housing sector must be introduced to preserve the stock of homes available for long-term let. Oh, more meddling. The removal of the tax relief benefits for short-term let, already enacted by Mr Hunt in the most recent fiscal statement, will mean that those incentivised by a better tax regime will no longer be so incentivised to move to short lets, so this is likely already sorted, as well as it will be. But I'm interested, how will this be done? Planning classes? Is temporary accommodation being moved into because it has been created? Or are there constant waiting lists for temporary accommodation? We know the answer to that, of course. The bigger picture here, though, preserve the stock of homes available for long-term let. This absolutely will not be preserved, and it needs to grow, as discussed, not be preserved by more regulation for landlords. They will come out and accept the 4% in the savings account, thank you very much. Here comes the reasoning anyway, thank goodness for that. I thought there wasn't going to be any, but apparently there is, so we go with that. The National Register, already proposed in the Renters Reform Bill, not RIP as I said, but to become back rehashed in the next Parliament. What's needed apparently is independently verified evidence of compliance with property and management standards and the new annually updated Decent Home Standards. Doesn't give you a lot of faith that they know how compliance works, does it? If you simply need to upload gas certs as required, EICRs and EPCs that are already on the government database anyway, that's not a biggie. Independently verified evidence of property and management standards. Shall I just save us some time and tell you where that will go wrong? Shall we go ahead and plan for the worst here? An annual report from a RICS surveyor on a property. Bad news for all, in my view, other than the members of the RICS, to which it would be absolute Christmas time, permanently. Although there wouldn't be enough RICS surveyors to fulfil this requirement. Although the popularity of the ASOC RICS might go up a few 100%, I dare say. I'm going to borrow a phrase now from the real world of landlording, from the agents that manage the bulk of our properties that are in Scotland. There's about 150 or so such properties. They're either central belt, the minority, or a little further out, within 20 miles or so of a major city, usually Glasgow. Their turn of phrase is, the tenant doesn't live well. They say it and they mean it in a caring way. It means the tenant doesn't keep their accommodation clean and tidy. When they say it, they usually mean the tenant is a hoarder, which is complex, of course. Often other mental health needs manifesting themselves through hoarding, or someone with below average standards, who doesn't think you need to see the floor to be able to clean it on a semi-regular basis. Does that mean we don't fulfil our obligations for compliance or maintaining the structure of the property? Of course not. What percentage of tenants does this capture? A few percent of ours? My gut feel says between 5 and 10%. How will a RICS surveyor write this report up? I look forward to finding out. Couldn't see much of the subfloor to make any pertinent decisions on heave. Might well be cut and pasted a few times, or similar. The broader point I'm making here is there is no allowance for the fact that, as I often say, there are as many bad tenants as there are bad landlords. Landlords not registered on the register can't go for possession, and rent paid when the landlord wasn't registered can be recovered by RROs, rent repayment orders. Frankly, go for it, but actually enforce it for a change, will you? It doesn't scare me, it just sounds more like red tape, more expense, and more of the tenant's money being spent on something that will favour a very small percentage of society or stakeholders. They want to make failure to register a criminal offence if not done within a certain period of time. Lack of compliance already carries a custodial sentence, e.g. failure to comply with gas safe regulations. There's a handful of mostly suspended sentences that have been given out after multiple breaches of the law, including improvement notices being ignored. Seems fair enough. Sounds more like lip service, but perhaps an effective deterrent. Compliance or inspections should be carried out on registered landlords from time to time by an inspecting body. Any chance of a cost-benefit analysis here, do you think? Sounds like a cushy, poor-value public sector gig to me. Or perhaps it will even be privately provided. Annual registration fees and fines should fund the register and inspecting bodies. I believe the correct phrase at this point, if we were in a court of law, would be IBID, Your Honour. Then we get to the most controversial part of the entire body of work, in my view. The bottom of page 8 of the report, security of tenure. Let's go. This beauty needs replicating in its entirety. So I'm back to the line by lines now. Security of tenure. All privately rented homes should be open-ended periodic tenancies that can only be ended on defined grounds, most of them involving default by the tenant. It's not wholly different from the current Housing Act, to be honest, and the Renters Reform Bill proposals. And in the real world, the vast majority of tenancies are brought to an end at the tenant's behest anyway. Always remember there are only two bodies that ever end a tenancy in law, the tenant or the court. Number two, I should say about number one, it's obviously missed the point around student housing apart from anything else, because they should be defined as 12 months in nature, if 12 months is for that year and is the suitable tenure, which it is widely accepted by both sides that it is, and the NRLA have done lots of work on this thus far. But anyway, holding that one aside because this is seriously important. Wishing to sell the property should not be a ground for ending a tenancy. Hold on a freaking minute. So properties designated as in the PRS, having had a tenant in there, cannot be sold with vacant possession. So the kinder that the landlord has been on the rent over the years, the more they get abjectly punished on sale. Here's a property today with a tenant in. It was rent £500 10 years ago and mortgage £200 thanks to a favourable base rate. Today the rent's still £500 because the landlord has been kind, but the mortgage is now £600. There's tens of thousands of properties like these, if not more. Worse, the market rent is now £800. That just about makes it viable for the landlord to hold the property. After costs and tax, they'll about break even, but they're okay with that. The tenant can't afford it though, so it goes to market. I'll tell you for free, in the environment where 0.2 is law, the market price of that property is about 500 over 800 of the vacant possession value, 62.5 pence in the pound. They would trade at 40 to 50 pence in the pound at auction. The landlord needs to sell the property because of financial distress. They've got a 65% loan to value mortgage on the property. The only way is to call the receivers in because the value has been totally destroyed by the tenancy. Not by the tenant, notice, but by the tenancy. Then a smart trader comes along and does a cash for keys deal, offering the tenant 3% of the value of the property in cash to move along and end the tenancy, creating the vacant value and realising it. But how much does the trader want to keep in that scenario? Clue, as much as possible. Wow, talk about a cottage industry. This is a disgraceful suggestion that contravenes private property rights and puts the rights of a tenant, who might have only had 6 months tenure, in front of the right of a landlord. It's ridiculous. This is a totally different level to the removal of Section 21. Preserve the private rented sector with these policies. Don't be so obtuse. Rant 3 is now over. Breathe, enjoy the journey, etc. So, point 3. Wishing to occupy the property should not be a ground for ending a tenancy apart from cases falling within the current ground 1 in Part 1 of Schedule 2 of the Housing Act 88. That is, cases where the landlord used to live in the property as their only or principal home and wants to move back. Oh, rant 4 already kicking off then, another ridiculous one. Here's a very believable and replicable scenario. Man and wife split up. They built up a property each over the years to let out when they got together, but they never lived in them, and brought a third to live in happily ever after. There is no happily ever after, so times ago they're separate ways. Neither can afford to keep the main residence on their own, very typical in divorce situations. Oh well, sell that one and move into the rentals then. You've got one each, right? No, you don't have the right to do that. What? As you say, Comrade Lenin, let's just crack on then like nothing has happened. These people are off their boxes. Rant 4 over in double quick time. More yoga prescribed. Heart rate now currently slightly elevated. Whilst lowering the notice period for grounds of antisocial behaviour is reasonable, this ground should be discretionary to avoid the risk of injustice to disabled people and victims of domestic violence. Furthermore, we agree with Generation Rent that the threshold for eviction should remain likely to cause, rather than capable of causing, nuisance. No. It should be discretionary only in exceptional circumstances. Antisocial behaviour is not being used as an angle to evict tenants. Show us one scrap of evidence. There's none. Let's stick with evidence-based antisocial behaviour evictions and put the needs of the many, the neighbours and the community, ahead of the needs of the few. Number 5, tenancy agreement should take the form set out in the Renting Homes Wales Act 2016. Oh, Wales, yeah, sure, they're doing really well. How are they doing with the new LHA rates, for example? Wales have the lowest proportion of listings affordable at 5.5%, says Savills. I thought it was the 30th percentile though. Clearly not. So they are doing okay on rent growth with their great shiny new system as provided by Labour. Rental growth for all existing tenancies in the year to January has been higher in Wales than in any other area of the UK, according to the ONS, at 7%. Rents for new lets have increased by 9.5% according to Zoopla, and by 36% since the pandemic, placing pressure on renters' finances. That again is from Savills. Oh, what a great model that is for us to be following since the model tenancy has been introduced. Are these people deliberately ignoring the data? Scotland has done a better job. Right up until the rent caps, they were actually doing very well. And now on the back of that, and lots of other mismanagement outside of housing, they're going to get their bottoms handed to them in the SNP and Green Party general election in Scotland. Using the Welsh system is simply an assumption that Labour there have done the right thing, even though things are going worse for Welsh tenants than any other part of the UK. This dimwittery knows no bounds. And number 6, the workable minimum is 6 months. There should be no maximum. At least they recognise the workable minimum is 6 months. No other choice really when they're so against short lets, of course. The worst bit is over, but the next section will have you similarly poised at the end of your seat, or make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Here comes the phrase you'll want to know, because this one's here to say, rent stabilisation. I'm actually going to separate this into a second video because I've been ranting now for over 45 minutes, so there will be a supplement part 2 for the first time ever. So stay tuned for that one.